Hello, everybody. My name is Fernando Hernandez. I use he, him pronouns. I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy and is finding ways to be okay with everything that's going on right now.
And I'm Luis Duarte, he, him pronouns as well. And today we will be touching upon the subject of immigration, more importantly, law enforcement and its relationship with advocacy at the border. And a little rundown of our presentation. We're going to start off with the history of CBP and ICE, continue to talk about current laws, and then from that, we're going to transition to advocacy work at the border, how advocates are and activists are targeted by Border Patrol and these deportation agencies. And finally, we're going to talk about the relationship between CBP and ICE with advocacy groups.
Yeah, so just a brief rundown of like Customs and Border Protection. It first officially began in 1789 with the first Congress, and it basically was just focused on being like a administrative sort of agency. So they just administered who came and who like left through records. And then in 1891, that greatly expanded it into focusing more on safeguarding the borders of like that were shaping Canada and also in like Mexico. And it was in 1912 where like they also inspected agricultural like goods. For example, now if you cross, you also have to like register that you have like fruit or something. So that's when that started. And then in 1924 they took on the more traditional role that they now have, as in like inspecting the borders and just being always ensuring that like who comes in and who comes out, and just like having their jurisdiction in like the borderlands. And just like as a final 2006, more recently, the Air and Marines joined the CBP, which basically means that they had the ability to have access to like helicopters and other things that made them their enforcement uh, more efficient in a sense.
And the other deportation force is ICE, and which is a subsection of the Department of Homeland Security, which was a direct response to 9/11, and it was created a year after the attacks by President George W. Bush. In the subsequent year, the DHS absorbed the Immigration and Naturalization Service (INS) and created the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Um, and the work that this agency does in terrorizing communities of colors is under the guise of their mission statement, which they state that they are focused on effective immigration enforcement, preventing terrorism, and combating the illegal movement of people and goods. But in the propaganda posted on their website, they are proud of the work they do and see it as essential. But maybe that's because they don't see the impact on the community and the dread that they bring to so many honest families.
Yeah. So, focusing on like past and current legislation that has greatly expanded the influence of Border Patrol and ICE. So first we have the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which basically denied like any workplace to hire like undocumented individuals through the I-9 forms, and then Operation Streamline, which basically criminalized the act of crossing the border through without like entering any checkpoints or just in general like port of entries. And then Section 8 U.S. Code, which basically outlines that Border Patrol and ICE have the ability to necessarily like stop and question anybody that they have like a reasonable suspicion that they may be here undocumented, which also leads to like racial profiling and other sorts of problems. And then Executive Order enhancing public safety and the interior of the U.S. So basically, that granted more power and more resources to the CBP by more money and just in general like more hiring of like CBP agents. And then for the final order that like Trump did was border and security and immigration enforcement. And so that's basically like bolstering ICE in addition to like having his plan of like the law coming to fruition in a sense by like through this executive order. So yeah, these executive like decisions and just in general legislation allowed for CBP and ICE to have more influence in like doing their job and have like more reign to basically have the discretion to do whatever they found justified.
And in the fact that we recognize that advocacy may have always been occurring at the U.S. Mexican border, we wanted to highlight some notable organizations that have been assisting our communities for decades. In Texas, Raices provides legal services, social programs, bond assistance, and an advocacy team focused on changing the narrative around immigration in the country while operating on the national front lines of the fight for immigration rights. Border Angels in San Diego provide free legal consultations. They assemble a bi-monthly caravan of supplies for asylum seekers in Tijuana. They assemble water drops in order to reduce the amounts of deaths in the harsh desert, and they advocate for immigration rights while providing many social services to the community. Me and Fernando actually were interns for them last summer, and it was a really good experience. Moving on to Arizona, a different part of the border, the Florence Immigration and Refugee Rights Project is the only organization in Arizona that provides free legal and social services to detained men, women, and children under threat of deportation. And in LA, there is the Central American Resource Center, Carecen, which for more than 3 decades has been pivotal in providing immigrant integration programs, delivering immigration legal services, fostering civic participation, and community engagement on immigration policy. Uncoincidentally, many were founded around the time that the Immigration Reform Act of 1986, which marks a time of increasing tensions against immigrants.
Yeah, and so moving on to like just how activists have been necessarily like targeted by like CBP and ICE. Early in 2019, CBP was confronted with with the accusations that they were targeting journalists, activists, and attorneys that were doing work at the border. That this work was being conducted with like the Mexican government, and they initially like rejected this idea, saying that they had no involvement in this. But it wasn't until May that this came to light, and they finally admitted it and disclosed their operations. Their activities included like surveillance, detention, and criminalization of humanitarian aid workers. So basically, they would like monitor people that would cross the border for like humanitarian aid work. They would question them once they arrived to the border, and they would criminalize them through Section 8 U.S. Code 1324, which is basically makes it illegal to aid and harbor illegal aliens, and that aid and harbor illegal aliens can be like justified and interpreted a lot of different ways. Most notably, it was interpreted against Scott Daniel Warren, which was an activist working with No More Deaths, a group in Arizona, I believe. He basically he helped prevented the death of two undocumented immigrants at the border, and he was basically charged with aiding and harboring illegal aliens. And so that was an attack, an explicit attack on like the activist community within like border works and just in general like activist communities that like did work at the border. He was eventually acquitted of these charges, but it just goes to show how these laws are being used to target like humanitarian aid workers.
A small example that we feel is emblematic of the increasing tensions between activists and Border Patrol agencies can be seen with what happened in San Diego, where the Mexican American border meets the sea. There, La Puerta La Esperanza, the Door of Hope, is a small space that used to open every year on Children's Day for families separated by the border to hug and be together for a few minutes. This event was organized by Border Angels and heavily supervised by Border Patrol agents. It is a practice that has ended by escalating tensions since the new administration and the new chief of the San Diego sector of the Border Patrol, Rodney Scott. Rodney Scott has continuously added regulations to the state park to discourage visitors on the American side. He has cut visiting time from 4 hours to 30 minutes, decreased the amount of visitors from 25 to 10, and does not allow anybody within 10 meters of the fence. On the Mexican side, the wall is adorned with paintings and families are having fun at the beach. The American side is desolate. Enrique Morones' response, the founder of Border Angels, to his increased hostility is that the whole world is watching in horror at this great country has abandoned its moral high ground and justifies nativism, exclusion, and honest discourse. All of us want secure borders, but telling families they can no longer hug and reducing their space and allotted time is immoral and a violation of human rights.
Yeah, and so like the lasting impact of like these relationships and just in general how the increasing power that CBP and ICE have will have over just in general like the border areas. So for one, there's going to be an increase of loss of life at the U.S. Mexico border as as law enforcement makes it increasingly difficult for migrants and humanitarian aid groups to help out there. So for example, you probably saw like in the news already like the past year how there was like a father and like a child that they were found dead. And so things like this, like law enforcement making it more harder for undocumented individuals to cross by like funneling them into areas that are more desolate and much more difficult to survive in. Like for example, there's a group called Águilas del Desierto. They're based in Calexico, and what they focus on is helping find missing individuals that may be at the border. And so it's work like that that would allow for like immigrants to be found, but also again, law enforcement is making it more increasingly difficult to do this work. Um, and the second point, as Luis mentioned, as CBP and ICE gain more power and gain more resources and gain more influence in general, they will have the ability to continually target communities of color, who are often the most vulnerable when it comes to immigration. And so, just like those lasting impacts will be like detrimental to those communities. And as far as our presentation goes, would be more than happy to take any questions that you may have, and we appreciate your time for listening to us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your time and your attention.